Welcome back to our CB Matrix Ministering to Youth module, and we're going to continue on in session 2, talking about how discipling youth is a team approach. Just one thing I want to pick up on, though, from last session. I'm here in a group, and we had a great discussion processing the goal of youth ministry, which I'm sure you all remember. But we were talking about activities and how they work together with the goal of youth ministry. And one thing that we just need to be careful of, and I want to make this a little clearer, is that one reason when we think about youth group and we think about limiting our activities or things that don't accomplish the main goal of youth ministry is that part of it is all the capital it takes from our resources, our people. Like all of our youth groups are run by youth leaders and who are volunteers. And so if we spend a lot of our time on events, that's going to take away from the job that they can do in training our students. Because as we're going to see, and we're going to get into this in session 3, really practically about how to disciple students, how to help them become disciples, how to train them into discipling others. That's going to be a large part of that is going to fall on your youth leaders. And so if your youth leaders are busy doing a lot of things that aren't accomplishing that main goal, it's going to weaken their ability to lead and accomplish the main goal. So it all kind of works together. One of the things that we need to do, people who are setting up youth ministry or thinking through the youth ministry for our churches, is even to protect our volunteers and help make sure that they're working and doing the main thing. So that's just one thought that I had coming out of the last session. But in this session, as we push forward, we're going to talk about families and talk about how youth and their families and youth group, how all of this goes together. And before we really get into that, I want you to think about something else. I want to ask you a question that you can think about now and discuss in your discussion time. But the question is, what role did your parents play in leading you to God? What role did your parents play in helping you become a Christian or grow as a Christian? Now, for all of us, it might be a little bit different. For me, I did not grow up in a Christian home. My family went to church on Christmas and Easter. And we went to a very formal church, and as I sometimes will tell people at our church, when I was a kid, one of my favorite times during the week was when we left church. That was for me a really good time because I thought our church was so boring and it had nothing to do with my life. And so we really didn't go to church, and even when we did go to church, it was just to make Grandma and Grandpa happy. And so I did not come from a Christian home, so my parents didn't spiritually lead me, especially when I was really young. Now, what they did do is they put me into a Christian school, mainly for the education. It wasn't, I don't think they really were hoping that I'd become a Christian or anything, or that, I mean, they weren't against it, but they were primarily motivated by the education. And so at this Christian school, I heard the gospel when I was really young, when I was a boy. One of my teachers shared the gospel with me, and I heard it, and I really understood the message for the first time. And I put my faith in Jesus, and I trusted in him for the forgiveness of my sins. But then I didn't go to church for a lot of years. I was part of a Christian school, but I didn't go to church because Mom and Dad weren't Christians. My brother wasn't a Christian, just sort of that Christmas, Easter kind of stuff. And until actually the point where I was in junior high, I kind of felt like I need to go to church. Like it just should be something I should do since I was a Christian, since I believe these things. And so I started attending church, and I started to get more involved, and my mom checked it out, and my brother checked it out, and I ended up being part of leading both my mom and my brother to Christ. And so they're Christians, and my family has a lot of Christians now, which is awesome. But my parents didn't really play a very spiritual role in my life as spiritual leaders because they weren't Christians when I was young. So think about that for yourself. You know, what role did your parents play in your life? I'm sure I would hope that some of you had parents who were active Christians, active followers of Jesus, and that they were real spiritual leaders for you. I mean, there's nothing, I just love to hear so much about people who grew up with parents who loved Jesus and who taught them about the Bible, and who families that memorized verses together. I love to hear about that. I think partly because I didn't have that. And my wife was like that. My wife grew up in a family where everybody really had a real relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And every night, after dinner, they would read the Bible together, and they would discuss the Bible together, and they would learn verses together and recite it on the way to school. And it was really wild. Even when we were dating, I remember having dinner with her family, and then after we were done, I went up to go watch TV, and they were all like, "What are you doing?" "We're gonna read the Bible now." And so that was quite a wake-up call for me, and it was just great. Even when we were in our early 20s, sitting around the table with her family, reading the Bible together, and just talking about it and praying for one another. It was very powerful. So I'd hope that some of you had families like that, had parents like that. I'm sure a lot of you also had parents who weren't Christians, or maybe they were Christians, but you just never really did family devotions together, didn't really talk about God, maybe you talked about God when you were a little kid, but then as you got older, your parents didn't really talk to you about God as much. I'm sure that's all kind of out there, and you can discuss that in your discussion time. But one of the things that I think is really important as we talk about youth ministry is to address the role of parents when it comes to teenagers. What role do parents play when it comes to discipling their kids and discipling their teenagers? And if you have your notes, you can see very clearly that I believe that it's the parents' job to disciple their kids. This is really important that we understand this before we go on much further in youth ministry, that it is the role of mom and dad at the end of the day, it's the role of the parent to disciple their kids. I believe this very, very firmly, that it's not the job of the church to do all the discipling of the kids and the teenagers and the youth. It's the job of mom and dad primarily, that they need to be the ones who are spiritually leading their kids, their teenagers, their students. And there's a lot of Bible verses that we could turn to that address this. One of the ones that I'd say really first captured my mind about this issue is Deuteronomy chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles, your Bible apps, you can open Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it's just an incredible chapter in the Bible that teaches us so much about Old Testament believers and what they thought and what they believed, and also really speaks to us, those of us who are parents, who are grandparents, or those of us who work with kids or youth in our churches about how we should think about these things. So I want to read that for you. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." Okay, so just in that passage alone, there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot of stuff that's going on. Moses is talking, and he says that famous line, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And that is, as you know from reading the Bible and studying the Old Testament, I mean, that was a powerful explanation of the nature of God. That Moses says there's not like a lot of little gods out there that run things. Every god had their own nation. Moses says there's one God, one creator of everyone. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. He is the one creator. He's the powerful one. He's the one in charge of the universe. He is the true God. There's lots of imposters. But there is one true God, and it's the God of Israel. And so that was just a powerful proclamation that God's people would give. And then it says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your soul and all your strength." And of course, Jesus picked up on that, and he said that what was the greatest command? To love God with everything that's in us. Love God with our heart and soul and mind and strength. That as followers of God in the Old Testament and as Christians after the coming of Jesus, we should make it our ambition to love God with everything that's in us, with every part of us. I think that's the language about the heart and the soul and your strength. God's saying, every part of you should be all about God. You should be passionate for God. That you should be a Christmas and Easter Christian. You should really, this isn't just a sort of thing that you do on Sundays, or you sort of tack on as an extra in your life. That your relationship with God and your love for God is central. And so we read that, but then it becomes very interesting. He says, these commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. So again, when God commands us, when we talked about this in our discussion from the last session here, but when Jesus says to baptize people and to help them, command them to obey all that Jesus commanded, Jesus isn't just trying to lecture to us, He's just not trying to fill our heads with a lot of knowledge, but Jesus wants us to obey. He wants us to put it into practice. And we see the very same thing in Deuteronomy chapter 6, that the message, the commands of God are supposed to be in our hearts. That means we're supposed to live it out. We're supposed to really do these things, not just have a lot of knowledge about them. Hopefully as you go through your studies here, you're not just filling your head with a lot of knowledge, but you're putting it into practice, and you're you're allowing it to transform your lives. But in verse 7, it starts to really apply to what we're talking about today. It says, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you go on the road. I love just that there's all these sentences here that are like, here's how you get kids, and here's how you get young people to understand what God's commands are. You talk about them. And notice, it doesn't say, well, here's how you get your students to follow God. You bring them to church on Sunday, and you take them to a small group, or you take them to a Sunday school class, and you bring them on Wednesday night and drop them off for youth group and pick them up, and then they'll know everything about God. That's not what it says. It says parents. It says talk to your children about God in everyday life. I mean, that's what's going on here. He says in everyday life, when you're just at home, when you're sitting around, when you're doing nothing, when you're trying to find something to watch on Netflix, talk to your kids about God. When you're driving to school, talk to your kids about God. I mentioned this with my wife, and when she was a kid and her family, they would memorize verses together, and as they drove to school, they would go over the Bible verses together, just in everyday life. It says there, when you lie down, when you get up, at night, in the morning, talk about God. And then you have that wonderful image of even creating symbols, physical, tangible symbols of God, and putting them in your life. And there's many devout Jewish believers who will do this, who will still to this day follow these commands of Deuteronomy chapter 6. And if you continue reading on, I'm not going to read it for you right here, but if you have your Bibles open, if you look at verses 20 and 25, what Moses expects is that as your children as the Israelite children were watching their parents go through festivals and go through different worship services and do different sacrifices, that the kids would be like, Dad, why do we do that? Why do we take this lamb to get slaughtered? Why do we say these prayers? And what Moses says is, take those opportunities to talk to your kids about why we do those things. There's that great picture in Joshua, I believe, where they set up the stones of remembrance to remember what God has done, and so that future generations could go back and their parents could explain to the kids, this is how God rescued us, this is how God saved us, this is how God brought us into the land of Israel. And so what we see in Deuteronomy is that mom and dad have a responsibility to teach their kids about God. And there's a lot of great ways just, that we can practically do this in our lives. My wife takes these passages very seriously, and so she writes Bible verses in our house, kind of all throughout our house. If you walk into the entryway of our house, there's glass there, and she will have Bible verses written on them. And our kitchen cabinets have glass on them, and so she will write Bible verses on the glass of our cabinets, and it's usually to reinforce ideas we're trying to teach our kids. And so in our house, you got to be ready at any moment to be quizzed on what's written on the Bible verses in our kitchen. So there's a lot of pressure there, and there's especially a lot of pressure when your 5-year-old knows them and you don't, and you're the dad. And you're a pastor. So this is a command to take seriously. Again, it doesn't say, Moses didn't say, well, take your kids to synagogue and they will do all the work. They'll train your kids. It doesn't say, take your kids to youth group and youth group will do everything. No. Mom and dad have the priority. They have the responsibility to disciple their kids. Let's look at another passage, Proverbs chapter 1, verses 8 through 9. It says, listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. They are a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. I don't know if you've ever realized this before, but the context of the book of Proverbs is it's wisdom. It's teaching the fear of the Lord. It's teaching instruction. It's teaching how to live a wise life. But it's constantly going back to remember what you learned from your father. Remember what you learned from your mother. And that the view is that Solomon will then pass that on to his children. That's the whole context of Proverbs. This is stuff that you should learn from mom and dad. How to fear God and how to have reverence toward God and how to live a life that is in accord with how God has created the world. All that wonderful stuff in Proverbs. It's supposed to be passed on from father and mother to children and generationally like that. And the church reinforces that. But really, it's mom and dad. That's their role. That's their job. I think of what my dad taught me. And, my dad was not a Christian. And so, I understand that. I don't hold that against him. My dad spent a lot of time teaching me to hit a baseball. He spent a lot of time teaching me how to sail, how to fish, and I'm very grateful for all those skills that I use. I want to pass those on to my kids. But what's much more important is passing on the godly heritage that I inherited from my wife's family. And I certainly don't want to interrupt that godly heritage that I have received. I want to pass that on to my kids. That's my responsibility as a parent. And my responsibility doesn't stop when they're in junior high, but it continues on as I continue to have that role to disciple them. Let's look at one more verse, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. Ephesians 6:4 says, "Fathers, don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." So again, this is now the New Testament, and the Apostle Paul is kind of reinforcing these ideas that we see over and over again in the Old Testament. And he's speaking against a culture that would have, that certainly Roman parents and Hellenistic Jewish parents, they loved their kids, but they were allowed to be rather harsh with them. They were allowed to do some things that discipline-wise we probably wouldn't do in our cultures. But Paul says, don't exasperate your children, but instead bring them up in training and instruction of the Lord. And he has, and I believe that what he has in mind here is training and instruction is not just spiritual training. There's a wider sense in which he's talking about education, that parents have a role to lead their kids even in their education. But as he says there, he qualifies it, and he says it's all in the Lord. Dads especially in this verse, dads, you have a responsibility to train your kids to follow Jesus and to understand who Jesus is. To use our words, you have this responsibility to disciple your kids. That is not passed off to youth leaders. That's not passed off to youth pastors. It's not passed off to the pastors of your church or your kids' church pastors, your kids' church directors. It's up to mom and dad to do the discipling. At least that is how God sees it in a Christian home. And so, that's just a little survey. I imagine that you have other verses that came into your mind, like train up a child in the way he should go, and when they're older, they won't depart from it, and all sorts of verses that might come to mind if you're a parent or a grandparent. And even if you're a youth leader, I hope, and you don't have kids yet, I hope you understand what these verses are saying, that parents have an important role in discipling their kids. They have a primary role in discipling their kids. But here's what happens a lot, sadly. What happens a lot, sadly, in Christian homes is that when students become junior high school students, parents start to think like, it becomes much harder to handle their children, as many of you know and have experienced. Or if you were a teenager not too long ago, maybe you remember how difficult you were to your parents. But there comes a point where parents start to, it seems from my experience, they start to pull back from leading their kids and discipling their kids, or maybe they never did it in the first place. And what happens is a lot of Christian parents that I've interacted with, they have this attitude, whether they say it or not, they have this attitude that it's kind of up to the youth group to disciple their kids. That we have a youth group at our church, we pay a youth pastor, we've got a youth team, we've got youth leaders. That's their job. They're supposed to disciple our kids. And so a lot of parents have that attitude. Maybe they don't say that, but that's practically through their actions kind of what they communicate. And what I want to show you is there's several problems with that. There's several significant problems with just letting the letting the youth group disciple your kids and sort of removing yourself as the parent. Now, I guess I should say, I listed a couple of problems there. Probably first of all, I should say it's just not biblical, right? I didn't list that as a problem, but after we just talked about Deuteronomy and Proverbs and Ephesians, I mean, it's just not biblical for you as a parent to ever say, well, it's now up to the church to disciple my kids. I can't do anything more with them, or I'm too busy, that's why we have youth leaders. That's just not a biblical attitude. But there's a few other practical issues that I think we should explore as well. And the first is that if you just sort of say, like, well, I'm going to let the youth group disciple my students. Parents who think this way, they often don't model the Christian life for their kids. They often don't model the Christian life for their kids. I have talked to a number of parents who have 19, 20-year-old kids, and those 19, 20-year-old kids have walked away from God. They don't want anything to do with church. They don't want anything to do with God. They're surrounding themselves in college or in their adult life now with the wrong kinds of people. And the parents will come up to me and they'll say, I don't get what happened. They were in youth group. They went to all those roller skating activities that you had, so I got made fun of for referencing roller skating as an activity that students would do in the 21st century. But they went to all the activities. They went on missions trips. They served in the soup kitchen. I don't get it. I don't get why they're walking away from God now. And then I drill down a little bit more with those parents, and I find out that mom and dad, especially dad, never modeled the Christian life for their kids. Dad never showed, like, well, I read my Bible and this is how I do it. Dad never modeled prayer for them. Dad never modeled service and Christian service, or the importance of having a church community, the importance of discipleship, the importance of accountability, the importance of worship. And so what happened was, because that was never modeled, that was never reinforced at home, as soon as the student passed out a youth group, it was kind of like, all right, well, I don't do that anymore. Dad didn't do it. Again, I don't even know that students always process these thoughts, but I've just seen this repeated over and over again, that it's great to have a strong, supportive youth group, but if mom and dad especially, if he is not setting a model in his home for pursuing God and developing a real relationship with God and modeling that for his kids, then that's going to be really hard to really grow that in the life of a student. If dad is not even sitting down and having spiritual conversations with his kids, and mom's not doing that either, it's going to be hard for us in youth group to make up that difference, especially if this is supposed to be a Christian home. Because if this is supposed to be a Christian home, it's one thing, I'll get to this in a moment, but it's one thing if mom and dad aren't Christians. But if your mom and dad are supposed to be, if your mom and dad are Christians and they're not being a model for you in your home, that's going to be really confusing for the student to think, like, well, what should I believe? What I see at home or what I hear at youth group? And so parents need to disciple their kids. The second problem, these are very related, but you should be aware, I hope you're aware, if you're a parent especially, that parents have more influence than the youth group. Right, that if parents don't prioritize God in their own lives, then students probably aren't going to do that either. I mean, we really, in youth group, let's say your student is part of a youth service or a youth small group, and that's a couple hours a week, and maybe they hang out with Christian friends and do some activities. That's great, but you're still around mom and dad a lot more than that. And so mom and dad have a lot more influence on the life of a kid than their youth group does. And so again, we need to help our parents understand just the role that they play. And even though their kids are maybe harder to talk to when they're teenagers, and maybe that the kids are going to battle against having these deep, meaningful conversations, the reality is that as parents, you're so influential. You play such an important role in the life of your students, and you have more influence than the youth group does. And I thought, as I was just even today, as I was putting this together, I thought of even another problem, and that's one of the problems by just saying, well, I'm going to let my youth group disciple my kids. One problem with that is just that youth group doesn't last forever. Youth group doesn't last forever. Now, some of our students wish it lasts forever, but youth group doesn't last forever. At most, you've got what, 6 years? Maybe you've got 6, 7 years, depending on how your youth group's structured, to really be there for the students. And if you're a youth leader, you can hopefully you'll continue to be a mentor in the life of that student, but they're going to go on, you know, and you're going to replace them with other people in your life to mentor other students. And so obviously mom and dad are not going away. You know, you're going to be in their life after the youth group. You were in their life before the youth group, you're going to be in their life after the youth group. And so youth group is here to support. Youth group's not here to take the job of discipleship. Parents need to disciple. You know, there's nothing sadder to me. I shouldn't say there's nothing sadder, but one of the saddest things to me is kids who come from Christian families who say, you know, I never saw mom or dad as a spiritual mentor in my life. I mean, that is, like, I mean, I remember once I was talking with a young man. He was like 19, 20 years old. He was from another church, and he was doing some work with our youth group. And he was just a great young man of God, and he loved Jesus, and he wanted to be a missionary, and he was real passionate. And his parents had been leaders at his church. And so I just assumed, like, his parents, you know, were just these wonderful Christian people who, you know, really got this. And as he was talking about his, actually we were talking about some of these issues about being a youth leader and what's our role with parents. And he said, you know, I've never viewed my dad as a spiritual leader in my life. And I mean, I was a parent. I mean, I had kids at the time. I mean, I still have kids, and that was just so haunting to me, to think that, like, this kid who grew up in a Christian home with a parents that everyone at their church would have looked up to them as leaders, to hear his son say, you know, Dad never really prayed with me. Dad never really opened the Bible with me. Like, it was scary, frankly, for me as a father to think, man, I don't want my kids to ever say that. If nothing else, I don't want my kids to ever be able to say, and Dad wasn't a leader in the home. Dad didn't lead spiritually. And so I hope that you believe, if for those of you who are parents, for those of you who will be parents, and then for those of you who have influence over the parents in your church, you understand that it's not okay to say, well, the youth group will take care of it. That's the youth group's job. It's the job of the parents. So what does that leave youth leaders to do? Well, youth leaders play an important role. Youth leaders support parents in discipleship. Youth leaders are there to support. In an ideal world, and we're always trying to work out what this means exactly, even in our own church, but our youth leaders should come alongside parents to disciple youth. Because it is true that things change in high school and junior high, right? I mean, once kids get to junior high, I almost feel bad for our kids when they enter into junior high at our church, because junior high can be so rough, and it's such a change, and, you know, they're going to a different kind of school and different kind of responsibilities, and there's just everything that goes on in junior high. It's tough. It's tough to be in junior high, and it's tough to be in high school even. And you know, we need our students. They do need youth leaders. They need men and women of all ages who are willing to work with youth, who are willing to be a mentor, who are willing to help them become a disciple of Jesus, who makes disciples of Jesus. All right, I snuck that in for you, so you don't forget the goal of youth ministry. Our students need mentors who are not their parents. They need them desperately. But we also need youth leaders who are connected to parents. That's what works best. I found this in my own life as I've looked at discipling students and how I've done that throughout my life. I've had the most success when I've been connected to the parents too. And I started this. This was not a program when I started it. I was in grad school. I was in seminary, and I was leading the junior high group at our church. And I decided there were just a few students, a few of the boys that I really wanted to mentor them, and I really wanted to kind of focus on them. And one of the things I did right away is I went to their parents, and I just said, hey, just so you know, this is what I want to do with your kids. I'm not, I'm not trying to be creepy or anything. I'm not trying to weird you out. I just want to, I want to help your student grow as a Christian, and we've got a good relationship. And so, I just went to mom and dad, and I said, where do you think your kid's at with God? Here's what I see. What do you see? And here's what I want to do in their life. And we just had that conversation, and I didn't hide it from the kid. I told the kid, hey, I'm going to talk to your parents. I'm not trying to get you in trouble or anything. I'm not trying to, your mom's not going to be like, well, you should disciple him on cleaning his room. That's the first thing. That wasn't the point of it. But the point was just to say, I was trying to show them, hey, you have a responsibility in this kid's life. And I knew that this one guy, student in particular, I knew that his mom was really active spiritually in his life, but I didn't think his dad was. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of connect with dad. And it was great. It was great because I was able to know what was really going on in the life of my student. You know, sometimes as youth leaders, it can be frustrating because you have the student that you think everything's going great, and then it used to be before Facebook that you would then start to hear rumors in youth group about your star student. You'd be like, what? Like, that's the student who I have so much hope in, and you find out all these things about his life. Now you just go on Facebook and you find out all these things that students might be into. But now if you can go to mom and dad, and if you have a relationship with mom and dad, you can find out what's really going on in the hearts and the minds of your students. Even just not too long ago, 2 young men I'm discipling who are just kind of transitioning out of youth group, kind of coming into adulthood. I'm discipling them. They're part of my small group. I'm a mentor for them. And I went to their dad and just kind of talked to their dad about, you know, what has he done in their lives? You know, what has he taught them? What has he instilled in them? Or, you know, where does he think they need to grow? And I kind of use that for myself just to help mentor them. And again, I told them that. I didn't say, hey, I'm going behind your back and I'm talking to your dad, but just said, you know, we all care about you. And you know, one thing I'm very intentional in my mentoring of students or of anybody, and I really want to see people grow as a follower of Jesus. Who makes followers of Jesus? And that's a surprise to you. I know that's my goal in mentoring. And so I'm really intentional about that. I don't want to waste their time or my time, frankly. And so I'll talk to people who've mentored them, including their parents. And that's a little odd at first. What I find is that youth leaders love this. Youth leaders would love the support of parents. Youth leaders would love to know that they're not just sort of wasting their time, that mom and dad are reinforcing these values at home. What I find is it's a lot trickier for mom and dad, because maybe mom and dad have never led spiritually before, maybe they don't do family devotions, and so mom and dad need to be led in this area by their mentors or their small group leaders or their pastors to say, hey, you've got a responsibility in your church. You have a responsibility to your kids. And so that's one way to look at being a youth leader, is that you are coming alongside parents. Now, what about parents who don't go to church? Because hopefully, if your youth group is healthy, you're going to be bringing in students who aren't yet Christians. You're going to be bringing in students who are not from Christian families. So what about them? Well, obviously the role's a little different there, because they aren't discipling their students because they're not Christians, so they're not going to be discipling their kids at home. But I'd still say that you as a youth leader or a youth pastor should reach out to those parents to say, hey, this is what we're studying, this is what we're learning. Why don't you come check it out? Invite them to church, invite them to learn about what their students are learning. One of my, the first youth group I ever led in, so after I graduated from high school, I was in college, and I served in a junior high group. And the youth pastor of that group, he had been a youth pastor. He ended up being a youth pastor for like 15 years, which is just incredible in youth ministry. He was been a youth pastor for 15 years. The way he came to Christ was because his kids first came to youth group. He and his wife wanted nothing to do with religion, wanted nothing to do with God, but his kids got invited to youth group. They came, they loved it, they gave their lives to Christ, and they eventually dragged mom and dad into church. And then eventually mom and dad became Christians, and he became a youth pastor. And he's still in ministry to this day. And I just think, so we have a wonderful ministry to the parents of these students. So if you've got a lot of students at your youth group who their parents aren't, it's an amazing opportunity. It's an amazing opportunity to maybe challenge those students to reach out to their parents. That was one of the blessings that God gave me in my life, was to help lead my mom to Christ. I mean, that is an amazing privilege that I'm just more humbled by as the years go on. And your students can play that same role in the lives of their parents. So youth leaders support parents in discipleship. So that means in order to do this, what are we going to need to do? We're going to need to train your parents to lead their students. Train your parents to lead their students. Because what I've realized, being a parent, you know, once I had kids and once my kids were, I don't know, couple years old or a little younger than that, I realized, okay, I got to disciple them, but how am I going to do that? And there wasn't like a manual for me, so I had to kind of figure that out a lot on my own. I went to my father-in-law, my mother-in-law to learn a lot on how to do that. But we need to train our parents in our churches on how to disciple their kids, whether they're little kids or students. I think this is counts for all of that. We need to train them. So I would just say, even one practical thing, you know, if you are, whatever your role is at your church, if you're the preacher at your church, or if you're a small group leader, if you teach a class of some kind, I'd say even go over this material with your parents and say, you know, Mom and Dad, go through Deuteronomy 6. Again, I think I mentioned this, but when I heard one of my pastoral mentors preach through Deuteronomy 6 one Sunday, and it just was like, wow, this is such a high calling that parents have. I didn't have kids at the time, but I was like, wow, what a high calling parents have to lead their kids spiritually. So do that. Do that with your parents. Lead them through Deuteronomy 6. Lead them through Proverbs 1, through Ephesians 6. Find those passages that speak to fathers, speak to mothers. You know, if you have men's breakfast or if you have men's studies, like talk about not just the normal men's issues that we talk about, but talk about them as leaders in the home and how they can, and how they're leading their kids, and if they're leading their kids. If they're not, you know, help them to do that. Make sure your students, or make sure your parents understand the goal of youth ministry. Right? Maybe they think that youth ministry is kind of like extra babysitting, or they think that youth ministry is to keep your kids occupied, or they think that youth ministry is to give your kids a lot of Bible trivia. You know, maybe they think that. So help them understand, no, it's about discipleship, that you need to be discipling them at home, and then we'll disciple them at church or in our small group, and together we'll all do this together, and we'll make amazing students, amazing young people who are going to be further along with God than we are, and who are going to do more amazing things than even we've done for God. You know, make sure that your parents understand the goals of youth ministry. And I would say that, I mean, I mentioned this a little bit, but really challenge them from the pulpit to lead their families. If you have opportunities to preach, or maybe even go to the preacher or preaching team at your church, I think it's so vital, even from the preaching, to hear that it's the responsibility of mom and dad to disciple their kids. You know, because that's just not a message that we hear a lot. And so I think that if the church, that's one great blessing that a church can do, is to say that we have this awesome youth ministry, and we are working to make it more and more awesome all the time, but it's only really going to get its full effectiveness if we have your support, mom and dad, if you're doing the work of leading it at home. And so challenge your parents from the pulpit even. Now, one thing that we do at our church that's a little bit unique is that we create we create our own youth curriculum. So we're going to get into how to kind of structure your youth group, some ideas for that to best promote discipleship in our next session. But what we do is we create our own curriculum. And it's not because we're the smartest, because we're not that smart, or anything like that, or we're not like the best teachers or anything, but we just really have our goal in focus. And so we create our curriculum in such a way to catalyze the discipleship relationships and mentoring relationships among our students and our leaders, and also to promote spiritual conversations at home. And so all of our curriculum we create, and that way we can go to our parents and we can say, hey, you want to know what your kid's learning at youth group? Go to this website and you can find all of our curriculum. You can find all of our studies. You can find all of our lessons. We do little video lessons that we put together that students watch before they discuss the lesson in their small group, kind of like the format for CD Matrix, except much shorter video than a 50-minute session, more like a 5-minute video. But we do that, and part of the reason that we do that is so that parents can know what their students are learning in youth group and can reinforce that. And so if you're at all interested in looking over our material, you can find it. It's at our website, pursuegod.org. And if you just go to /youth, you can find all of our youth curriculum and the curriculum that we've developed and that other partners have developed that we utilize. And that's all there for free if you're interested in using any of it. And it's not branded with our church. It's just there to be used. And again, the reason we do that, if you're interested in making your own curriculum or using a curriculum like ours, I would just encourage you to do something that's accessible to parents, so that parents can know what their students are learning. And not just, you know, my kids will come home from church and I'll be like, what did you learn at church? And they'll say, I don't know. I'm like, okay, well, my kids are often at church for 3 services, and I'm like, you sat through that lesson 3 times, and you don't know really what you learned, So, and my kids are pretty bright, so I know that's not the. So it's helpful for me as the parent to go over the curriculum myself, so I can reinforce that. I can know what they're learning. So I think I have that website in your notes, but pursuegod.org/youth. And then one other thing I would say is to have parenting seminars, or whatever you'd want to call them, parenting summits, or whatever name you can use to get parents in the door. I know at our church we've had like a father-son activity nights and stuff, where we've had some tough conversations. Like one of the things that one of our pastors did was he had a father-son night, and it was for boys, I think like 5th and 6th grade, and their dads, and it was a talk on sex, which, that's a pretty uncomfortable subject for most dads to talk about with their kids. And so one of our pastors just felt like, if we can just begin to have this conversation as a group, then maybe they can have it at home. And so do stuff like that for your parents, give them, not only train them on how to lead spiritually, not only expose them to your students' materials, but even just have opportunities, have parenting training seminars or classes or studies where you train them and give them tools. I think that's what's going to make them successful in discipling their students, is to train them and to give them the tools to disciple their students. Because, I think a lot of parents, especially as they read God's Word, if those parents are Christians, they've got the Holy Spirit in their lives. As they read the Bible, I believe that they're going to see God's vision for how mom and dad should lead their students, and they're going to be inspired by that. They're going to be inspired by Deuteronomy 6. But unless they have the tools to lead their kids or their grandkids, it's going to be really challenging for them. So equip them not only with training, but also with tools. And what's really cool is now we're at the point with a lot of parents who are really doing this in the lives of their little kids, but even in their students. And I just am so thankful for every brave mom and dad that is actively discipling their students at our church. And I was just thinking of one guy at our church who is just a regular guy at our church, who is he ushers sometimes, and he's in a small group, but he's not a preacher. He doesn't do anything on the stage really. He's just kind of a regular guy, but he's really taken this message to heart, and he has sons who are 18 and 16 years old, and he looked at he realized that he had squandered a lot of years. He allowed mom to do all the spiritual leading, and he kind of just sat on the bench while mom did all the leading. And then when the boys were 12, 13 years old, they went on to youth group, and dad just kind of let youth group do the work. And he's realized now, man, he blew it. He really blew it. At least he did for some years. But so he's taken the time he still has with his kids in his home, and he's taking them through Bible studies regularly, and he's praying with them, and he's modeling things for them. And not to say that he's a perfect dad or a perfect follower of God. He tells his kids, his own struggles or things that are difficult for him in his own walk with God. And he's real with his boys. And I'm close with one of his boys, and they're so thankful for that investment that their dad has made in their lives, and that he has taken this time to really talk with them about God. It's made more of an impact in their lives than anything I've ever said to them, than anything any other youth leader has said to them. It's just their dad opening up God's Word with them and praying with them, and it's made all the difference. And so I hope in your church you have stories like that, or you can have more and more stories, because I really think that this goal of youth ministry, it's so big that your youth group can't do it alone. If it's just up to the youth pastor, if you have a youth pastor, or just the youth leaders, we can't do it alone. We can't do all that work of discipling students without the help of parents at home. But when we have the parents in place to disciple students, and when we have the youth group in place to do the work of discipling, then we will really see our students become disciples of Jesus, who make disciples of Jesus. And so I think the more that we can throw that out there as a vision and as a dream for our churches, the better it'll be. And also, let me say too, again, if you're a church leader and you've got kids, whatever age they are, you need to model this. Like, we can't just get up on stage and say, hey, you really got to disciple your kids. But I don't do that. That's, my wife handles that for me. I'm too busy doing ministry. It's like, no, that's your ministry. It's just as much as your ministry is to your church. Your ministry is to your family. And so I hope we don't just say this, but we model it with our lives. And because again, our kids are watching, aren't they? Our kids are watching, just like our kids, the kids of all the families in the church. You know, if they know that dad takes them to youth group and never prays with them, that's going to say something to them. And even if you're a church leader and your kids hear you talk about the importance of prayer, reading the Bible, and yet you never do that with them, that's going to speak a lot to your kids too. And so youth discipleship is a team effort. It's a team effort. It involves parents, it involves grandparents. We didn't really talk about that, but I think grandparents can play an important role. And it involves the youth team. And again, the youth group is not here to do the work of discipling by themselves. They're here to come alongside you and to support the parents, and that together we can raise up the next generation of disciples who are going to make disciples. So that's the end of this session. In the next session, we're going to talk about really practically what this could look like. I want to give you a model for youth ministry because we can have the right goal in mind, but if we don't have the right model, we're going to fall short. So that's this session, and I hope you have a fruitful discussion.